What are the best graphics settings for Bloodhunt? Well, best is a funny word as it can mean different things to different people, but I went through all of the graphics options in Bloodhunt in detail to figure out exactly what matters in terms of performance to give you the best settings that work for your needs and not just a random list that works on my PC. In this video, I will explain what each graphics setting actually changes and show you examples so you can decide which ones matter to you. I will also explain the performance gains and losses for each setting to allow you to focus on what really gains you more performance, instead of blindly turning everything off in hopes for more FPS. Finally, I will show you my personal setup which I use for a balance of amazing in-game visual quality and the best FPS boost overall for a smooth gameplay and beautiful looking clips. Hey guys, I'm Motion, and I cover the gameplay side of Bloodhunt in depth to give you everything from general tips and tricks to detailed guides on very specific topics such as weapon statistics, archetype abilities, and map locations. If you want to see more detailed videos like this one, make sure to hit the subscribe button and activate notifications so you can stay up to date on the latest changes and additions. Remember to hit the like button if you find the video useful, and feel free to join my Discord server if you have any questions, or pop them in the comments. I also stream here and on Twitch, so if you want to chat sometime, make sure to follow me there. I'll leave all the links in the description. A quick note for PS5 users before we jump in, as the following settings are for PC only. The PlayStation version of the game currently has two modes: a quality mode, which runs at 4K 30 FPS, and a performance mode, which runs at 1440p 60 FPS. I would highly advise you run the performance mode, as this will give you the best multiplayer experience by using AMD FSR to upsample from 1440p to 4K. At the time of making this video, there are no plans to implement a 1080p 120 FPS mode. But if you'd like to see this in the future, then let the devs know in the official Bloodhunt Discord server. I recommend sticking around for the upcoming comparisons so you can fine-tune the options on your setup, but I'll add a chapter that you can skip to if you just want to copy my settings if you're in a hurry. For full transparency, I tested all of these settings on my personal rig, which I'll pop the specs on screen for those who are interested, and gained some extra information from the Sharkmob developers to confirm the accuracy of my testing. I ran the bulk of the tests in the Elysium and the tutorial for best consistency, and some in a match to confirm some particular situations, which made for some interesting clips as I get shot at while in the menus a lot. All of the footage for this video was captured after the tests were finished, so any on-screen FPS counts may not be relevant or reflect what I'm talking about when they appear. Okay, so now that's all clear, let's jump into the game settings with the basic tab, as these are quick to go through. Set the display mode to full screen, as this will give the game more resources and in turn more FPS. I did try borderless full screen to see how much of a difference it would make, and it was a solid 10 to 15% less FPS on my PC, so certainly some free performance to be had there. When using variable refresh rate technologies, this setting might need to be set to full screen for better results, since it might only work in full screen. For display resolution, I recommend you run your screen's native resolution to get a sharper image with more detail, which for me is 2560 by 1440. You will be able to make massive performance gains, however, by reducing this, so something to potentially come back to if you need extra performance after changing the other settings. VSync synchronizes the frame rate to the screen refresh rate in order to avoid image tearing when the screen switches from one frame to the next. When using variable refresh rate technologies, this might need to be disabled for better results, since the screen synchronizes to the game's refresh rate instead. I disable VSync to help cut down on input response times, and because I have a variable refresh rate monitor. But if you're experiencing screen tearing, then I advise you activate this. The frame rate limit setting will depend on your setup. This setting limits the in-game frame rate in order to avoid overworking the CPU and GPU and use less electricity. This is the recommended way of limiting frame rate if you're not using VSync. You want to set this to match your monitor's maximum refresh rate, which for me is 144Hz, or slightly lower if you're experiencing dips in performance and would prefer a more stable experience. If your monitor has a maximum refresh rate that isn't on the list, then you can access the settings file by going to Local App Data, Tiger, Settings, Display Settings, and changing frame rate limit to match your monitor's maximum. Beware that if you change the in-game settings afterwards, it will reset your custom choice, and you'll have to repeat the process. If you see this symbol while playing, however, it means that your monitor is not set to its highest refresh rate mode, and it will be limiting your performance in-game. In this case, check your monitor's built-in options, Windows options, and potentially even graphics card options to toggle this to a higher refresh rate for the best performance. This option is a great place to prevent the game from taking up too many resources if you're a streamer on a single PC setup, and can prevent drop frames due to GPU overload. Frame rate smoothing artificially tries to smooth out the game's frame rate, but this can make mouse movement feel sluggish and imprecise, so I recommend you disable this and use frame rate's limit instead if needed. I prefer to up the brightness by a small amount as it helps me see better in darker areas, but this is more personal preference and will depend on your monitor's settings, so feel free to change this to your liking. Just try and avoid the extremes. AMD FSR 1.0 increases the GPU performance by rendering the world at a lower resolution, then upsampling using AMD Fidelity FX Super Resolution. I personally dislike FSR in Bloodhunt as I feel it makes the screen look blurry and hinders in-game visibility, so I had this off. But if you're less sensitive to the changes, this is an area you can find major FPS gains by sacrificing some sharpness and small details. I would advise sticking to the quality focused settings if you're using this. Resolution scale determines the resolution of a world rendered by scaling it. This should be set to 100% for a sharper image with more detail in the world. Your heads-up display does not scale with this option, so you'll still be able to easily read it even on lower settings. If your system is below the minimal recommended specs, you can play around with display resolution and render resolution to reduce the load on your GPU at the cost of visual quality. Moving on to the advanced settings tab, which is where things get interesting. Let's have a look at what each setting does and which one's the most taxing on your system. View distance determines when faraway objects start appearing and how quickly objects lose quality based on distance. It also streams in more parts of the map further away from the player. Anything beyond the set distance will be hidden by a fog-like effect. This means that buildings will not fully render at longer distances, and you will not be able to see major details like trees or vehicles, and finer details like props and graffiti will only appear when you get within the set range. I was able to measure a significant difference in FPS from the Ultra setting to low, and this setting will hit the CPU hard for world streaming, which may cause stuttering elsewhere if it's too demanding, so I recommend starting with Ultra here and turning it down later if you experience stutters or lags as you run around the map. Material quality determines how realistic objects look by adjusting the quality of certain surface shaders. Character rendering can be very expensive in performance, and lowering this setting will increase stability when multiple things are being loading simultaneously, in a fight for example. I was unable to measure a difference in performance on my PC, but people on lower specs or higher resolutions will see substantial results by reducing this. I would advise you match this setting to your general specs, low for a budget PC and high for an expensive rig, but feel free to drop this by a notch over other settings if you're running a higher resolution or want a boost in stability. Texture quality adjusts the fidelity and sharpness of all the in-game characters, objects, and surfaces. This option will have a very visual difference between each setting and will have a high cost on your CPU as it streams in all the new textures. Lowering this setting will reduce the amount of assets being loaded in at a time and therefore increase stability as you run around the map. Again, as I'm well above the recommended specs, I didn't see any consistent change to my FPS, but fewer assets being loaded in means generally lower CPU usage and lower risk of stuttering in more intense situations. Similarly to material quality, this option should more or less match up with your setup, with less powerful CPUs being hit the most. You should avoid the higher settings if you have the game installed on a hard drive, have less than 3 GB of VRAM, or have less than 16 GB of RAM. Texture filtering determines the sharpness of textures which are being viewed at a distance or at an angle by changing the filter quality, with trilinear being the worst, and 16 times anisotropic being the highest quality. There are minimal gains to be had here, both visually and in performance, as it is just a filter. So set this fairly high and bring it down if needed after looking at other, more performance-heavy settings. Moving on to the effects setting. This option controls the quality and quantity of special effects like sparks, smoke, flames, explosions, and even weather. Increasing this option will gain you higher quality density and lighting on effects at the cost of CPU and GPU performance. If you're noticing long frame drops from effects which cover large portions of the screen, like gas clouds, reducing your render resolution will help more than lowering this. I was only able to measure a small percentage in change in FPS from each extreme, but testing this consistently in a fight is almost impossible as there are many different effects going off at the same time, so lowering the setting will be good for gaining stability. You cannot gain a visibility advantage in the gas by lowering this setting, so if you have the resources, feel free to increase this one. Foliage determines the density of grass and smaller bushes in areas such as the memorial park and cemetery to make them appear more natural. These areas can take up a lot of resources in general, but the extra foliage itself is only a small margin of this. Turning this down will increase visibility slightly in these areas and gain you a small amount of performance on your CPU. I recommend starting with the setting off or low and working up from there if you have the spare resources. Lighting quality determines how many lights are being rendered and the quality of these lights. This will mean that a higher setting will have certain areas of Prague lit up in a much more visually pleasing way, which can make quite the difference between low and ultra. I'd love the lighting effects on higher settings, but this option can be fairly performance heavy, so definitely want to prioritize over other settings if you're in search for more FPS, especially on higher resolutions. I don't advise turning this off if you can help it, as even on the medium setting, you gain a lot of atmosphere over turning it off. Volumetric fog enables fog effects in the game and has a pretty substantial visual quality change across the board, since so much of the in-game art style relies on it. This is a great visual pleaser but another very demanding setting and can be solely responsible for around 20% of your total frames on the highest setting. Turning this off completely can gain you both significant visibility in the longer ranges and a large boost to performance at the cost of visual quality. This setting will be responsible for the fog mentioned in view distance, so turning this down or off will make the difference in render quality at distance more obvious. Prioritize this setting first if you're looking for performance gains. Ambient occlusion will add soft shadows to objects that are in close proximity to each other, such as props near a wall or underneath exposed pipes in cars. This is another great visually pleasing option, making the scene more realistic and detailed, even with the changes being subtle. This setting's performance cost scales with your resolution, so some substantial gains are to be had at 4K, with less so for 1080p. I don't find the lack of these shadows to be noticeable while in a match, so feel free to grab the extra FPS here. The screen space reflection setting determines the quality of the screen space reflections, which gives sharper and more accurate reflections in puddles and shiny surfaces around Prague, making the scene more realistic and detailed. I love the added reflections, which gives the city a more 3D feel with the post-rain setting. There was very little performance cost for my setup, but your mileage may vary as this will scale with your resolution, with 4K users seeing more benefits than 1080p users. Going from high to off will make a very big difference visually, so if you have the performance available, I recommend starting on the higher end here. Moving on to shadow quality, which determines the quality and details on shadows, making this scene more realistic and detailed. Shadows play a big part in setting the mood in games, and can sometimes give you a heads up before even seeing an enemy. However, with Bloodhunt being such a fast-paced game, and with the already dark nighttime setting, shadows are much less important and become a visual accessory to increase overall visual quality. Shadows are a major player in your game's performance, second only to volumetric fog, and I advise you start with them off and build up if you have the spare resources. Anti-aliasing is responsible for removing jagged edges from the game and significantly increasing visual quality. TAA has a better anti-aliasing quality than FXAA, but can cause some motion blur as a side effect. Hair and grass in particular will be relying heavily on anti-aliasing to appear smooth. TAA will also help remove a lot of noise from the highlights in the image called specular aliasing, whereas FXAA will only smoothen sharp edges. There are some small gains to be had on the GPU side if you don't mind the loss in visual quality, but I recommend using TAA as it is an industry standard nowadays and will greatly improve visual quality across the board. Subsurface scattering simulates light passing through objects and particularly affects skin and leather. This setting is a big player in performance and has a very subtle difference in visual quality, but before you turn it off, the setting is disabled by default as you enter the tutorial or a match. So your only performance gains here will come from the Elysium and character customization screens, where the effect can be admired to its full extent. Having this option on will not affect performance outside of the Elysium, but will give you substantial gains in the Elysium. If you have the performance spare, this is a nice visual addition to your archetype customization, but is a very subtle effect, so you may not even notice it. Motion blur gives a smoother and more cinematic looking game, especially at lower frame rates. However, some people experience motion sickness or just don't like the effect, in which case I recommend disabling it completely. Doing so will gain you a small boost to your in-game FPS and give you a clearer image while in movement, which in turn will help you spot other details better, such as an approaching enemy. Chromatic aberration is an effect which distorts the colors around objects and makes the edges fade away. This gives a more cinematic feel at the cost of some image sharpness. Using this will give you a very slight GPU performance loss, and is barely noticeable as you move around Prague. Again, this option is based on personal preference. Film grain is another after effect which is added to give a more cinematic feel to games. Similar to our previous option, there are very little GPU gains to be had by disabling this, and it is up to you whether you like the effect or would rather a sharper overall image. Bloom creates the glow of light you see around bright objects, which can obscure some finer details. This is an option I like to activate as it brings a lot of the lit areas of Prague to life, with streetlights and the bright neon lights near terrace or disco making the biggest differences. This setting brings overall visual quality up substantially, and I have never experienced the effect getting in the way of visibility, so I recommend you have this on at least medium to make the most of Prague's lighting. Disabling Bloom completely can gain you a small GPU performance boost, but this will scale at higher resolutions, so 4K users may find more of a benefit to lowering this than 1080p. Lens flares act in a similar way to Bloom, but add sharper flares to bright objects such as street lamps. Lens flares have a very small cost of GPU performance and aren't particularly missed compared to Bloom, so feel free to leave this one on if you want. Our last option in the advanced settings is light shafts, which enhances light sources by enabling them to project shafts of light to improve on lighting quality. These are most noticeable when partially covering a bright light source such as the moon. Light shafts also have a very small cost of GPU performance, so are less important compared to other options on the list. With all this information, you should be able to make your own custom settings that suit your setup specifically. But this is where I show you my setup, for anyone who wants the same settings as I use for playing and streaming. If you skipped to this part from earlier on, make sure to hit the like button for saving you some time. With my setup, I aim for a balance between ultra and low to get the best of the visual quality and effects from the ultra preset and the best performance from the low preset, without sacrificing any visibility around Prague. Running the game on maximum settings on my PC gives me 170 FPS, while running the low preset will give me 285. My custom setup gives me 220, which is around 10% higher than the medium preset. Let me know in the comments if you want me to cover the best settings to use for competitive play, and feel free to screenshot these settings and share with a friend. If this video helped you out, or you like the attention to detail that I put into my videos, please hit the like button and subscribe with notifications on for more in-depth guides and gameplay breakdowns.